Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 450. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. I got a lot to talk about in today's show, but first, I want to mention that at the Libertarian Institute, we are holding a fundraiser. Trying to raise a little bit of money. Most of the money goes to pay staff so we could keep producing all the great content that you enjoy from the Libertarian Institute. Tons of podcasts, The Scott Horton Show, Don't Tread on Anyone, Conflicts of Interest, Vital Dissent. Again, so many great shows there. And then also books. The latest is Questioning the COVID Company Line. But of course, we've also published all four of Scott Horton's books, including Fool's Errand and Enough Already. I write articles pretty much every single day for the Libertarian Institute, sometimes more than one a day. Most of them are published in the news section, along with the co-host of this show, Connor Freeman. And then we have featured articles, regular op-eds on the page every day. So much great content at the Institute. Make sure you help us out. Let's keep this thing going and get it to thrive a little bit more. We've really expanded. We're producing a lot more. We've hired a lot more great writers, including Ted Snyder and Ted Galen Carpenter, who before they worked for the Libertarian Institute, I was on this show telling y'all that they were the most important writers on the war in Ukraine, and now they're writing for us at the Institute. So that's really awesome. And again, please support what we're doing there. And with that, let's get into the news today. The first story I have was written by Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Wall Street Journal. Western officials knew Ukraine didn't have enough weapons and training for counteroffensive. This is crazy. The Wall Street Journal reported on Saturday that Western officials knew Ukrainian forces didn't have enough training or equipment for their counteroffensive, but hoped they would be able to break through anyways. The report reads, when Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the way. They haven't. Leading up to the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which was launched in June, the Discord leaks and media reports revealed the U.S. didn't believe Ukraine could regain much territory from Russia. But the Biden administration pushed for the assault anyway, as it rejected the idea of a pause in the fighting. And if you remember, leading up to this, Zelensky was begging the West, saying, please, we need more weapons before this counteroffensive gets underway. And the West was saying, we think you have enough. We've given you enough. And they threw a little more here and there. But, they kept saying that you had enough. They expect this counteroffensive to be successful. And, in a way, you could imagine that they're going to lie. They're not going to say that the counteroffensive will be unsuccessful, or, even admitting that at all may damage morale and things like that. But still, to go forward with a maneuver that you're unprepared for is absolutely insane. And that's what Washington appears to have forced Kiev to do here. So back to Dave's article. Ukrainian forces have struggled to push through Russia's defenses, which include vast minefields, resulting in heavy Ukrainian armor losses in the first few weeks of the counteroffensive. The U.S. officials speaking to the New York Times and the Washington Post have blamed the lack of success on Ukraine's, saying Ukrainian forces are not the combined arms tactics they learned from NATO countries. And so this is something we talked about a little bit on the show last week, but I could go into a little bit more detail here. And that's the Washington Post reported that there were that Ukraine was losing because they weren't engaging in the tactics that the West wanted them to engage in. And so the tactics that the West wants Ukraine to engage in are multifaceted. So they involve tanks, artillery, infantry, all moving in coordinated methods along, and I'm guessing over like several miles of Russia's defenses. And so this is supposed to be a very complicated tactic that I'm sure is supposed to confuse the Russians, get some of their defenses out of position, and then also to attack Russia's defenses with multiple types of weaponry at the same time. But Ukraine hasn't been doing that, according to the officials that the Washington Post spoke with. And the officials say that Ukraine has reverted back to its Soviet era tactics, which is using small groups. in small, I'll put an asterisk on that because, when you talk about how many lives this is, it isn't a small number, but 15 to 50 apparently is about the number of infantrymen they like to send to probe Russia's front lines. And so, I'm sure we've seen some videos of this. This is basically the videos that we've been seeing of the fighting in trenches. You'll have a Ukrainian or a Russian soldier run through trenches and kill a whole bunch of people in these videos that we're seeing from these GoPro cameras and stuff like that. So, there have been, I don't want to say like Ukraine hasn't launched a single offensive maneuver or anything like that throughout this whole counteroffensive, but they haven't taken any substantial amount of territory. And, clearing some Russians from 100 foot of trenches probably isn't any kind of substantial gain or something that, Russia can't use as air power or artillery to pound those trenches and then, reestablish the Russian control there, which is probably what's going on a lot. So, back to Dave's article here, he says, but the journal report noted that U.S. and Western officials would never have launched an offensive without air superiority, something Ukraine doesn't have. Despite the situation on the battlefield for Ukrainians, the U.S. wants Ukraine to push harder to try to break through against Russian forces, regardless of the risk of major casualties. The journal report said that the prospect of a stalemate for a long war would require the U.S. and its allies to provide huge new infusion of sophisticated armaments and more training to give Kiev a chance at victory. So let's talk about one of those weapon systems. I wrote this article for antiwar.com on Friday. White House rushing to get F-16s to Ukraine by end of the year. The Joe Biden administration believes it is important to get F-16s to Ukraine by the end of the year and estimates the warplanes could arrive around that time, although the White House doesn't assess that F-16s will alter the course of the war. National Security Advisor Jade Sullivan said at the Aspen Security Forum, Washington is trying to rush the delivery of F-16s to Kiev. He said, we are going to push as fast as possible. A spokesperson for the National Security Council, John Kirby, told Fox News on Thursday that the White House believes the date will be around the end of the year. Now look, the F-16s will get there probably towards the end of the year, he explained. A coalition of 11 countries have come together to train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16s and provide Kiev with several planes. Washington has signed off on the transfer of warplanes to Ukraine. The Ukrainian foreign minister, this is Dmytro Kuleba, said he expects the training to begin in about a month and the F-16s to arrive after the first of the year. Kuleba said training should start sometime in August, maybe at the beginning of September. Simultaneously, legal decisions necessary for the transfer for the aircraft and the aircraft themselves will be prepared. I think if Ukrainian pilots fly the first F-16s in Ukrainian airspace by the end of the first quarter of next year. So he's talking about more late February, sometime in March, where, the U.S. is maybe talking about a couple months further than that at this point. Kirby went on to say that the F-16s will not change the course of the war and stressed Ukraine's need for other weapon systems. But it's not our assessment that F-16s alone would be enough to turn the tide here. He continued, Kiev needs the 4 A's: artillery, ammunition, air defense, and armor. Defense officials told CNN on Tuesday that the U.S. is nearly out of weapons and ammunition to send to Ukraine. At a conference in London last week, General James Hecker explained the arms shortage will probably not be resolved soon. NATO is dreadfully below where we need to be, and is probably not going to get better, well, at least not in the short term. But we've got to make sure that in the long term we have the industrial base that can increase what we have. Even with Ukraine's lacking air power, ammunition, and other conventional artillery rounds, the Biden administration is pressing Kiev to push its counteroffensive. And so, I should highlight this here too, to kind of go along with Dave's first story, that not only is Ukraine short of air power, but they are also short on artillery. I think, we still see reports that Russia is firing, especially when they want to, between 5 and 10,000 artillery rounds a day. I'm not sure if they're doing that when they're just in these defensive positions, but that's certainly the amount they report to be firing when they're conducting offensive operations to take Bakhmut and other areas of Ukraine. Now that Ukraine's launching artillery and trying to launch a counteroffensive, they're only firing 2,000 to 3,000 artillery shells per day. And that's actually more than the U.S. wants them firing. They want them using other tactics that require less artillery. And so here you have the U.S. really almost forcing Ukraine to carry out these operations. And not only do they not have air power, but they also really lack a significant amount of artillery power and just feeding Ukrainians into the meat grinder. All right, couple stories here on the weapons systems themselves. So I wrote this for the Institute on July 23rd. Department of Defense Inspector General, American weapons in Ukraine funneled to arms traffickers, criminals. The Pentagon Inspector General found that arms Washington has sent to Kiev did not undergo required inspections. A report from the Inspector General found the weapons the U.S. sent to Ukraine in the hands of criminals and on the black market. The Arms Control Act requires the White House to establish an inspection system for weapons the U.S. sells or gifts to third countries. The law mandates the monitoring of countries continue to the end use of the weapons. In Ukraine, the embassy in Kiev has been assigned responsibility for monitoring the weapons transfers. The Department of Defense Inspector General report on American weapons transfers to Ukraine from February to September of last year found that legally required monitoring was not taking place. And this is a quote from the report. The DoD is unable to conduct end-use monitoring in Ukraine because completing end-use monitoring in accordance with DoD policy requires in-person access to the defense equipment provided. Intelligence methods provide some accountability for observable platforms such as missiles and helicopters, but smaller items such as night vision devices have limited accountability. The Department of Defense Inspector General found deficiencies in the Department of Defense's transfer of military equipment to the government of Ukraine requiring end-use monitoring, including Javelin missiles, Javelin command launch units, and night vision devices. And in Ukraine's security and accountability of U.S. provided military equipment requiring end-use monitoring, the report added. So, just, maybe a little bit more clarity here. This end-use monitoring is a legal term, and there's two forms of it. There's end-use monitoring and enhanced end-use monitoring. Either way, the U.S. isn't meeting their requirements and needs with the weapons it's transferring to Ukraine. There's no personnel on the ground observing, which would be, one of the key things that would have to happen. And then the receipts that the U.S. has gained from Ukraine, the Pentagon is saying that they are insufficient. Now, remember, when we are talking about here from February to September of last year, this is only a few $1 billion worth of weapons. A lot of these weapons really start to pour into Ukraine around the end of summer, so September last year, but they probably were not really getting distributed out to the battlefield, right? They get to Ukraine and take some time to get there. So, and then also the Inspector General report, all the instances they found of these weapons ending up in the hands of places they shouldn't be, they're from June, July, mid-summer area. So my guess is that we would need that the net 6-month report from September to February of 23 to really start to get an idea of artillery shells and some other Stinger missiles, things like that were going to Ukraine, and drones, and if these have ended up on the black market at all. All right, so back to my article. In a section of the report that is heavily redacted, the Inspector General listed some cases of American weapons not making it to their intended recipients. The cases included in the unredacted report include a Moscow-influenced criminal organization that produced grenade launchers and machine guns, a pro-Kiev militia that tried to sell dozens of rifles on the black market, and an group of arms traffickers who were selling weapons and ammunition stolen from the front lines. In response to questions about the report, a State Department spokesperson admitted that American weapons were being used for illicit purposes in Ukraine. Despite these issues, the spokesperson emphasized that Washington felt the transfers were too important. The U.S. government remains keenly aware of the risks of possible illicit diversion and is proactively taking steps to mitigate these risks in close cooperations with the government of Ukraine. We are realistic that we are sending weapons to Ukraine defend itself in an active conflict, and there is a risk these weapons could be captured if territory changes hands, which happens in any war. And so it's kind of interesting because they kind of deflect the actual question, which wasn't what happens if Russia captures these weapons, is what happens if criminals capture these weapons. But, Russia is also capturing some of these weapons, and Israel has reported they're extremely concerned about that because they think Russia will transfer these weapons to Iran, where they will be reverse engineered and then used against Israel or Israel's proxy jihadists in Syria. Earlier this month, the White House came out against a provision in the Pentagon funding bill that would create a special inspector general for Ukraine aid. The Inspector General for the Afghan War, John Sopko, has warned that without sufficient oversight of the weapons and money sent to Kiev, Ukraine will face many of the same problems as Afghanistan. And what he's explained is that the U.S. allowed so much corruption of the aid it sent to Afghanistan that actually made the situation worse for a lot of people. So if you send a bunch of weapons to Afghanistan and you give them to people who are, decent human beings, actually, right, or something like this, right, you form a police group and they actually start to enforce the law, not do anything corrupt or anything like that, then that might be something that helps Afghanistan. But the U.S. sent Afghanistan all these guns, and they gave them to people who were extremely corrupt and just used that to create their own corrupt fiefdoms and become, warlords and things like that. And so it didn't improve the situation at all in Afghanistan. Sopko is saying that Ukraine faces a similar risk, especially with all the money, cash pouring into the country. The demand to create an office to oversee the more than $100 billion in aid Congress has authorized to send to Ukraine has been attacked as Russian propaganda. Representative Adam Smith, a Democrat from Washington and the head of the House Armed Services Committee, said in December that calls for more oversight of the billions of dollars in aid was a part of Russian propaganda. And that's a quote from him. All right, so let's talk about the impact of these weapon sales on American arms makers. I wrote this for the Institute last week. Lockheed Martin predicts strong profits as global instability rises. Lockheed Martin believes global instability is driving demand and sees an increase in annual profits. Washington's proxy war in Ukraine has caused an increase in arms spending among NATO members, boosting the weapons maker stock prices. On Tuesday, Lockheed raised its annual profits and sales outlook on strong demand for military equipment after making the announcement the company's stock price increased by 1%. Reuters reports Lockheed expects a full year net sales to be between $66.25 billion and $66.75 billion, up from its earlier forecast of $65 billion. The billions in profit are driven by sales of big-ticket items like F-35s. However, Lockheed has struggled to produce F-35s that can perform to its promised abilities. In May, the government found the plane's engines have a serious problem dealing with heat. And this is from a POGO report. That's the Project for Government Oversight. The F-16's engines lack the ability to properly manage the heat generated by the aircraft systems. That increase in engine wear, and auditors now estimate that the extra maintenance will add $38 billion to the program's life cycle costs. And so this is already probably a multi-trillion-dollar program anyways, and we're adding just billions and billions more to that pile. And we're talking about $38 billion. This is a lot of money. This is money that if it was used in a different way or returned to the American people could make substantial differences in people's lives. But instead is just being thrown away on F-35s that do not perform to their promised abilities. And likely because Lockheed Martin pays a lot of money to lobbyists and then also funnels a lot of money to Congress through donations. So the arms maker has additionally experienced a boost in demand for smaller systems like Javelin anti-tank missiles. The White House has shipped thousands of the Javelin systems to Kiev since Biden took office. And of course, we know that those aren't even always ending up in the hands of Ukrainians. A lot of the billions of dollars in Javelins that we sent Ukraine have probably ended up in the hands of armed traffickers and who knows where in the world, killing who knows who. As well as predicting future successes, Lockheed announced it beat expectations regarding quarterly sales. According to Reuters, quarterly net sales rose 8.1% to 16.69 billion, beating expectations by almost $1 billion. Last year, Ian Bond, the director of foreign policy at the Center for European Reform, described the surge in market for weapons as the highest since the Cold War. This is certainly the biggest increase in defense spending in Europe since the end of the Cold War, he said. Prior to the Russia invasion of Ukraine, Lockheed's stock price traded below $340 a share. The price has increased to over $450 within a few months. On Tuesday, Lockheed stock was valued at $456 per share. That was last Tuesday, a week ago from when most people are going to be listening to this episode, by the way. All right, American cluster bombs are in Ukraine. This from Dave DeCamp. Ukrainian officials have told the Washington Post that Ukrainian forces have started firing U.S.-provided cluster munitions at Russian soldiers in southeastern Ukraine, which was later confirmed by the White House. Last year, the White House called the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine a potential war crime, but President Biden signed off on the delivery of the civilian killing munitions earlier this month. Cluster bombs are so hazardous to civilians because they spread small submunitions or bomblets over a large area. Submunitions don't explode immediately on impact, can kill or maim civilians for decades to come, as they have in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, where the U.S. dropped hundreds of millions of bomblets during the Vietnam War. According to the Post, by sending the bombs to Ukraine, President Biden bypassed a U.S. law that prohibits the production, use, or transfer of cluster munitions with a dud rate of more than 1%. The dud rate refers to the percentage of bomblets that don't explode. And I've read that that number is actually as high as 25%, but the New York Times has said that the dud rate will likely be around 14%. The Pentagon claims that the munitions have a dud rate of 2.35%, which is probably the least likely one. And they test it where maybe they're dropping this like on a concrete surface or something, so most of these things explode. Where they're being dropped in forests or fields or something, they don't hit hard enough and sometimes don't explode. The U.S. is giving Ukraine dual-purpose improvised cluster munitions in the form of 155 millimeter artillery shells, which are packed with 72 bomblets each. And the U.S. has millions of these, by the way. It's not clear how many are going to Ukraine yet, but we could see not, I don't know if we're going to quite reach the Vietnam War era levels of these weapons being used, but not an insignificant number either. It's not going to be a few thousand of these bomblets laying around at the end of this war. It's going to be hundreds of thousands or millions even. The Biden administration officials had defended sending cluster bombs to Ukraine by saying the U.S. and Ukraine are running out of other types of ammunition. They have also accused Russia of using cluster bombs during the war. Russia has denied this. I don't really buy the Russian claim, but I should look into this more before I just flat say that Russia has used these when I obviously haven't been to Ukraine, don't know for sure. Human Rights Watch said in May that there were hundreds of documented or alleged uses of cluster bombs by both sides on the conflict, but the U.S. provision of cluster bombs will make the use of the weapon much more widespread, as the Pentagon said it will provide hundreds of thousands of shells. A Ukrainian official told the Post that they are firing cluster munitions at Russian troop positions in an attempt to break up Russian trenches. I've heard from a lot of officials that they don't really expect this to make a significant difference in the war. And again, that, Ukraine is only using them because they don't have the more conventional munitions. Now, I do wonder if this is going to create any problems for Ukraine's offensive. And maybe if this is a little bit of an admission from the White House that Ukraine really isn't going to take very much territory, because my understanding is cluster bombs don't make a particularly effective offensive weapon because of the bomblets being left behind. If you fire a cluster bomb in a region and there's 4 or 5 unexploded bomblets and you have soldiers walk through because you've captured that territory, then they are now subject to stepping on those and being injured or killed by your own weapons. So And now Russia has accused Ukraine of killing journalists with a U.S. cluster bomb. Russia on Saturday accused Ukrainian forces of killing a Russian journalist in the southern Zaporizhia region using U.S. provided cluster munitions, which are widely banned due to the harm they cause civilians. The Russian Defense Ministry said that the reporter for Russia's RIA news agency was killed, and 3 other journalists were wounded by the Ukrainian artillery attack. The Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman said the responsibility for the journalist's death will be shared by those who have sent the cluster munitions, referring to the U.S. The U.S. has said that Ukraine is already using U.S.-provided cluster munitions, but the Russians claim that the cluster bomb that killed the journalist is not confirmed. And so the U.S. is just saying, we don't know what killed that journalist at this point. All right, one more story here on Russia. Experts say demining Ukraine could take hundreds of years. And of course, as we're talking about cluster bombs, this is all the more interesting. Ukraine is the most heavily mined country in the world, and demining it could take decades or even hundreds of years, the Washington Post reported on Saturday. The sheer quantity of ordnances in Ukraine is just unprecedented in the last 30 years. There's nothing like it. Greg Crowther, the director of the program Mine Advisory Group, told the Post. The report said that 30% of Ukraine's 67,000 square miles have been culminated by mines and other ordinances and will require demining. The area is larger than the United States state of Florida. So just absolutely insane amount of ordnance being dumped into Ukraine right now. Now, just a couple quick articles on China before we wrap up here. U.S.-Australia largest ever joint military exercises. The U.S. and Australia on Friday launched the largest ever iteration of their Talisman Sabre exercises, as the U.S. is increasingly focused on building alliances in the Asia-Pacific against China. Talisman Sabre started in 2005 and is a biannual exercise between the U.S. and Australia. This year's iteration involves participants from 11 other countries and over 30,000 military personnel. The U.S. Navy Secretary Carlos Del Toro spoke at the opening ceremony on Friday and said the massive drills served as a warning to China. He said, "The most important message that China can take from this exercise and everything that our allies and our partners do together is that we are extremely tied by the core values that exist among our many nations together. In a symbolic gesture to demonstrate the growing military ties between Australia and the U.S., on Saturday, the U.S. commissioned a naval vessel in Sydney, the USS Canberra, an Independence-class littoral combat ship. It marked the first time the U.S. has ever commissioned a U.S. Navy ship that was commissioned in a foreign port. And so this is interesting, especially since it was a littoral combat ship, which the LCS class of ships is also known as the little crappy ships, because they don't perform very well. They've never performed to their standards, and the Navy actually tried to get rid of them, and Congress wouldn't let them. They wanted to just decommission these ships and get rid of them, even though they had some of them, I think, like decades left in their lifespan. They said they're not worth it to have to operate these things. And, now not only do we have them, but we're using them for symbolic gestures in Australia and provocative against China. Del Toro had previously said the U.S. Navy envisions turning Australia into a full-service submarine hub for the U.S. and its allies in the region under the AUKUS military pact that was signed between the U.S., Britain, and Australia in 2021 that will result in Canberra acquiring nuclear-powered submarines. The U.S. and Australia were joined in the Talisman Sabre exercises by militaries from Fiji, France, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Tonga, Britain, Canada, and Germany. Personnel from the Philippines, Singapore, and Thailand also attended as observers. The exercises involved firing live fire drills and will conclude on August 4th. A Chinese naval vessel was spotted surveilling the drills, which Australian military officials said has happened since 2017. All right. House and Senate set up for fight over how much military aid given to Taiwan. The House and Senate are set up for a fight over how much military aid to include for Taiwan in 2024 spending bills, as each chamber's appropriations granted a different amount, Defense News reported on Thursday. The Senate Appropriations Committee on Thursday passes 2024 State Department and foreign aid spending bill that includes $113 million in foreign military financing grants for Taiwan. The House Appropriations Committee bill includes $500 million in FMF grants for Taiwan. FMF is a State Department program that gives foreign governments money to buy U.S.-made arms. In 2023, National Defense Authorization Act included $2 billion in FMF for Taiwan, but congressional appropriators only approved the funds as loans that need to be paid back as opposed to grants, over concerns the State Department budget would need to be slashed in other areas. While the Republican-led House is looking to give Taiwan more military aid than the Senate, the state and foreign aid spending bills is $52.5 million, lower than the Senate's version, which is $61.8 billion. The two chambers will need to negotiate the final version, and it's unclear how much military aid Taiwan will end up getting. My guess is it's going to be the higher number. That's usually how these things work. When the two sides come together, they just take all the military spending, because at the end of the day, everybody's funded by Lockheed Martin. All right. Last up here, North Korea issues nuclear warning over U.S. nuclear arms submarine in South Korea. So Connor has been updating the Korea story on the show for the past couple of weeks. I just want to tackle this one because I felt like it's more of a follow-up to what he reported on the show on Thursday, which is the USS Kentucky docked in a South Korean port last week. This is a nuclear-armed submarine, and North Korea has now issued its response. Dave DeCamp writes, North Korea on Thursday issued a warning over the U.S. deployment of a nuclear-armed submarine to South Korea, saying the provocation could potentially justify Pyongyang using its own nuclear weapons. And so, this is pretty serious, and I believe it was on Shane's show, the Hapa show. I forget what the actual full name of it is now, but it's absolutely fantastic. And Shane's been my friend for a long time, so I really always enjoy doing his show. But we were talking about Korea, and I think one of the problems is that the U.S. has right now is that there's no instance where we could de-escalate, right? Because the Korea policy really isn't about Korea, it's about China. The US is, doing all of this to put more military assets close to China. But, we also say, a way to tie South Korea and to get South Korea more involved is to talk about the North Korean threat, the same with Japan. And so, we've coalesced all these other nations together and increased military ties with them. And while ostensibly it's for North Korea, it's really all about China. And so we really can't de-escalate with North Korea unless we're willing to de-escalate with China. And as we've seen, there ain't nobody in American politics that's even really questioning that at this point. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for today. Thank you all so much for tuning in. If you're still listening, head on over to the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org/donate, and make a donation. Help us out. Really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.